Over the last 5 or 6 months, as we've dealt with lockdown and the whole crisis around COVID, we have all experienced a wide range of emotions, many of them challenging emotions. In the end, as time has gone by, we've had to face the failure of many of our plans, inability to put lots of things into action. I have dealt with a variety of different kinds of emotions and feelings that we have felt over the course of this year. But in the end, what a lot of it boils down to is disappointment. In the end, there's so much we're not able to do, there's so much we are not in control of, that a lot of us are sinking into a kind of apathy, despair, and disappointment. So tonight I thought I'd take a closer look at what disappointment is really about, and perhaps how we can manage it better, and even perhaps change our feelings. A lot of our lives is about anticipation and expectation. We do certain things and we expect certain outcomes. We live in a world that is ordered and organized in such a way that we expect certain outcomes. And whenever we do something, we basically have an expectation of how that is going to turn out. But at the same time, whenever we create such an expectation, we are in danger of creating disappointment for ourselves. When things don't work out the way that we expect them to be, when things aren't what we envisioned. Sometimes it's just a little bit let down that we feel. At the other extreme, we can feel depressed, disheartened, and even angry. And I think a lot of people are feeling angry about how they find themselves in the current situation and how all their beliefs and expectations about their lives and about their year have been dashed. Sometimes those feelings of anger are turned against the world, against the government, against the virus, and worst, against other people in our environment who've probably got nothing to do with why we're feeling anger. And maybe even worse than that, we sometimes will turn those feelings inwards towards ourselves and create stress, anxiety, and even illness. Disappointment is not an easy feeling to experience because it feels so helpless. It feels that there's nothing we can do about it, because the whole point of what it is that what we were trying to do didn't work out. But of course, if we accept the basic facts that we can't expect everything that we plan and everything that we do to pan out exactly as we think, logically, disappointment is a natural emotion that we should feel as often as regular, happy and sad. Certainly, one of the things about disappointment is that it's generally equated with a kind of sadness or a feeling of loss. And loss is a very challenging emotion for us, is capable of creating a lot of pain. But in this case, the pain is being caused by the distance, really, between what we expect and what is real. Mostly, what we expect, apart from the specific outcome of whatever it is that we're doing over there, is happiness. We often say that we've got a right to happiness. Much of our philosophies, going back even into the ancient world, are all about being happy or finding happiness. And it's an entirely legitimate pursuit. After all, there's a lot that's difficult on earth, so seeking happiness is pretty much the least we can do for ourselves. But we tend to believe that happiness is dependent on certain criteria, and almost all of those criteria are generally defined as outside of ourselves. So we might believe there's something that we need to have in order to be happy. Something needs to be fulfilled in order to be happy. There's something that we are depending on outside of ourselves in order for that happiness to be real. And of course, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment when we do that. So we can sit there in a state of despair and sadness and loss. And in fact, in many other states of despair or sadness and loss, there's very little that we could do about it, other than manage the emotions. But in this particular case, we can look more closely at what it is that we expect and believe about ourselves, about our lives, and about other people and things outside of us, and begin to understand how these external factors are such big players in our quest for happiness. Unlike loss of a loved one or losses that are beyond the realm of our own lives, in this particular case we can reorient ourselves in the face of that loss and realize there are things that we can do that make us happy, that are not dependent on those things outside of ourselves, or if they are sensitive to those things outside of ourselves, can be understood in such a way that we don't have to experience it as a state of loss. Certainly, since the experience of disappointment really reveals that our hopes and expectations are out of alignment with our reality, it is those expectations that need to be better managed. And our expectations are caught up in what we want. Desire is a very complex thing. Because of desire creeping into everything, disappointment can creep into everything. So that's what makes it so hard to avoid. There's so many little factors that we expect and want and believe we should get in everything that we do, that we easily feel disappointed because we're not really managing the reality of those desires. A great step to start with is to ask ourselves, what is it that I really want? Why do I want that? Why did I want that? Sometimes the honest answer is going to be that the reason why we want that is no longer valid, or the reason why we want that is because of someone else, something they said or did, or because they have it. Those can lead to the feeling of dissatisfaction when we get it, because it isn't really legitimate in the first place to want that thing. Sometimes the issue might be something like not believing that we deserve what we get. And I know that for some of us that might sound a little ridiculous, but for many of us, underlying the going for it, is that hope I'm going to get something more than I bargained for. Hope I'm going to get something that I know that I can't really get, that I never get. So when we do get it, we don't know what to do with it, and we think, maybe it wasn't for me. Maybe I was just pushing myself so hard, but it isn't really what I wanted. You know, it boils down to even things like, for a child or for a young person, do I want what I want because my parents say I should get that? Or they want that for me? Or they want me to be happy? They want me to be happy, so I should want that. So that they're happy, that I'm happy? If you pull it apart like that, you can see that there are all these tenuous threads of desire not really connected to the heart, and we are setting ourselves up for major disappointment that also has consequences in the world around us. In that example that I just gave you, with the perception of the parents or the relationship with the parents, the beliefs about the parents, all of those things complicate matters further and set us up for disappointment. So clearly, a lot of disappointment arises out of improperly managed expectations and improperly understood expectations. And that's why getting to the root of why we want something and trying to get that to be valid with our own heart's desire is one of the things that we need to go for. The first step in managing disappointment then is to look at those expectations and the situation that we find ourselves in and identify what is in our control and what isn't. You'll remember, if you watch the show regularly, that one of the key factors of Stoic philosophy is to identify what is inside of your control. The Stoics say that almost all unhappiness can be removed once you remove those things that are not in your control from your efforts to control them. Only control what actually is inside of your control. And we can go as far as to say often, that is yourself. The only thing is yourself. And if we can get that into our minds, we're controlling the right things and probably not easily going to get ourselves disappointed. But the steps to that certainly will be what is in my control and what isn't in my control. And being able to tell the difference will give us the ability to understand how better to deal with things when they don't go according to plan. The lockdown situation that we find ourselves in is a great example of something that is absolutely not inside of our control. And the circumstances that have been imposed upon us are not inside of our control. Some people are reacting with anger and disappointment because they're still trying to take control of what's not in their control. They insist that the solution will be if you let me do what you're not allowing me to do. And they're really still dealing with the same complicated mix of desire, expectation, and disappointment. And they're really just setting themselves up or making themselves very vulnerable because they're getting onto that narrow thing of the only thing that will make me happy in this situation is if you allow me to do something. And that hasn't solved the problem of what you're really in control of. So when we identify those things that we are not in control of, we can begin to understand that disappointment in response to those doesn't make an enormous amount of sense. It's like just being disappointed over the color of a flower or the shape of something in nature. Those things are not really inside of our control. When we look at those, or even the things that are inside of our control, we then need to look at the question of, are my expectations realistic? Given the circumstances, given my situation, my skills, my talents, what am I in control of? Is it reasonable for me to expect the outcome to be that? Am I setting my goals too high? Or alternatively, am I allowing myself to believe that because I'm not capable of that or not capable of that, my goals are not realistic? Many people bring themselves down. Many people also fear failure. And all of those kind of things can affect what we expect the outcome to be. People who fear failure often expect the outcome to be failure. Talk about setting yourself up for disappointment. Because when failure happens, instead of being delighted that exactly what they expected came true, of course they feel disappointment because it's a failure. So the expectation of failure and the underestimation of yourself is a huge setup for a disappointment that can't be easily resolved. It's always a valid question, though, to ask yourself, is my expectation realistic? Is it consistent with what I'm doing and who I am? Sometimes our unrealistic expectations, where we expect too much of ourselves, are going to be the source of disappointment. And that's probably one of the most common sources of disappointment that we face. We expect too much of ourselves, or we expect perfection from ourselves. And we don't know how to really identify what the correct outcome is, because it's based on expectation and belief instead of reality. We also might sometimes try and avoid disappointment by either setting the standard very low, or by avoiding doing whatever it is in the first place, or at worst, just believing about ourselves that nothing really ever works for me, I never get anything right, I may as well not do it. Avoiding disappointment is not a good strategy for living, because quite frankly, disappointment is inevitable sooner or later, because we're not in control of everything, and because our expectations cannot possibly match every outcome. Outcomes are always going to surprise us and then inevitably let us down. So if we realize that we're acting out of avoidance of disappointment, we are trying to push ourselves into a very narrow and quite frankly useless corridor of action. We need to accept disappointment is a possibility. Let me look at a realistic outcome, but realism does not mean I will automatically avoid disappointment. So taking into account the possibility of disappointment is more about the reality of the expectation and can actually be used or be part of a framework to prevent loss, because it was part of what was possible. I accept that it's possible that it's not going to go that way. Certainly will minimize the negative impact of the disappointment. Something that is important in avoiding the negative consequences of disappointment is not to ruminate on it and ruminate on your failure or your inability to be in control. Disappointment easily turns into depression and apathy. And apathy then prevents us from any further action. If disappointment is scuppering all your actions, then you are actually turning it into a weapon against yourself. It's very important not to hang on to the feelings. We tend to internalize the feelings of sadness and despair, and it can literally start changing our nature. It can start making us a more negative, apathetic, depressed kind of person. So we must try and develop a strategy by which disappointment is a spur to improving our action rather than an emotion similar to sadness. We feel sad when we're disappointed, but we've got to see it as a step of a strategy, not just a reactive emotion. So how do we do that? How do we adjust the strategy? Well, according to Professor Tara Well of Columbia University, we need to identify the reasons for the disappointment in each situation. The first one being, we believe that only a certain outcome will make us happy. That's what I've been talking about. And so we need to really ask ourselves, where does this definition of happiness come from? Very often it comes from the media or social media, comparison with other people. Or very often we just get told what it is we need in order to be happy. So the first step is really making sure that we identify our own source of happiness and that we interrogate for ourselves, why do I think that will make me happy? Because that will often be because of other people, because of other media, because of advertising, because of all sorts of reasons that don't come from me. I mean, the irony is, of course, that a lot of those external sources don't even work to make us happy in the first place. And a good example is advertising. If you think about it, advertising is designed to make you buy something. By telling you you will be happy if you buy this something, you are kind of buying into a contract, because you know this, that says, yes, by having that I'll be happy for a short amount of time, because what you know is that they've got to sell you another one, or they've got to sell you the new improved model. So they've got to implant the idea of unhappiness. They've got to later on saying, you thought you were happy but you weren't really happy, you actually need model 2. So we're getting ourselves into this kind of roller coaster, vicious circle of not really happy type happiness. A good example of why it's not useful to hook your happiness to the outside world. And in fact, research shows that when we try and get happy from these external sources, often perpetrated by the media, we don't even achieve that happiness we were looking for. People who buy the thing that they were told is going to make them happy don't get happy. That's a good reason not to go there. We might also believe, secondly, that only a certain person or a certain thing can fulfill our desires. There is only one route in this situation. When we depend on only one thing or depend on only one person, it's like expecting to meet your soulmate on this particular app. It's kind of like putting all your eggs in one basket. If we rely entirely on one source for fulfillment or happiness, we inevitably become disappointed. In addition, anyway, to the fact that when we invest all our expectations in one person or one thing, we tend to also create a halo effect around that. We start believing that everything around that person or that way is good. And so it becomes all the more important to rely only on that, and we set ourselves up for greater disappointment. Thirdly, says Prof. Wells, we also create such tight conditions around our happiness and our satisfaction. We believe it must happen in a certain amount of time. That's, for example, if you've got a career goal, it's got to happen by a certain age or a certain amount if it's a salary that you're looking for. We often kind of pin our successes on these very specific limitations, that the limitations themselves might not be realistic and themselves are not something we're in control of. So we double up on the problem. We're saying, firstly, I need to be the MD. That's not actually something we're in control of. And secondly, it has to happen by the time I'm 30 or 40. That's also not something we're in control of. So we're doubling down and making it more and more complicated for ourselves. A lot of those beliefs are based on comparison. We compare ourselves with other people who've achieved the same thing. And then we set ourselves up. We've got to say, okay, if they did it by the time they were 30, I've got to do it by the time I'm 30. We've now created an artificial condition for ourselves and set ourselves up for another great disappointment. That does take us into the road of comparing yourselves with other people, and comparing ourselves with our friends and our apparent peers is a dangerous route in the first place, because what's good for you is not the same as what's good for someone else, and what you're in control of is not the same as what someone else is in control of, and your particular requirements for happiness are not the same as someone else's requirements for happiness. Remind yourselves of those things every time you compare yourself to someone else for any reason. The underlying criteria are different. In the same way that our genes are different, I can assume the other things about us are different as well. Let me try and create my own criteria. And finally, says Professor Wells, we have this problem of creating very fixed scripts about how things are going to come together in the end. We have a desire, then we create a kind of a script that says exactly what's required in order for that desire to be fulfilled, which of course is not likely to happen. And then worse, if it involves the other people in any way, we then have to script them into it as well, so that once she does that, I can do that, and then we're fine. And you're not in control of another person either, and other people are not likely to follow the script that they don't even know that you wrote for them. And when life doesn't go according to our plan, we blame it on them, we blame it on the circumstances, and we feel disappointed. Everything I've spoken about today is really about outcomes versus reality. And I've spoken about different ways that we might set up false outcomes for ourselves. But what if we take a completely different approach and say, let's remove the outcome? And by removing the outcome and concentrating on the process, we engage with another core spiritual philosophy that we see expressed frequently in Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies, as well as Western philosophies about living in the present. And that is to let go of outcomes. By focusing on outcomes, we're focusing on hypotheticals, possibilities, imaginary things, and obviously it's a great setup for disappointment. So ultimately, in the end, the one philosophy that fits all says I cannot focus on outcomes. By focusing on the journey, we focus on what really matters in any process. It's the process of the doing, because the outcome is unknown and frequently surprising. Learn to identify when we blame, especially in the current situation. We blame the government, we blame the virus, we blame everyone and everything outside of ourselves. Even if it is the government that is responsible for a lockdown, you're not in control of them. So it becomes pointless to blame, because blame becomes a way of saying, there's nothing I can do about it, it's not my fault, therefore my feelings of disappointment are justified. Therefore I don't have to act in a way that's going to find me happiness. And we've gotten ourselves into a terrible hole that, however valid it may be to blame the government as in they're responsible, it's not valid in terms of your own happiness and your own path. In the end, that's what matters. Your happiness matters. And as long as your happiness is contingent on things outside of yourself, sooner or later, virus or not and government or not, it is going to be dramatically scuppered by something not in your control, by something you could blame. In the end, there is a beauty to disappointment. The beauty to disappointment is that it allows us to find acceptance of reality, acceptance of ourselves. It allows us to identify what really makes us happy and where that comes from. It gives us wisdom in the end and teaches us to let go of control. Because as all the ancient masters tell us, when we let go of control, only then do we find true happiness. Well, if the government won't let you work, I'm sure there are plenty of ways you can figure out how to lose control. Have some fun, and I'll see you next week.